Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Many people will not realize or know anything about something called the Belt and Road Initiative. This is China's plan to essentially acquire massive tracts of land all over the world for the benefit of the Chinese Communist Party. For example, in the United States right now, over 350,000 acres of arable farmland is owned by the Chinese. Not a single acre in China is owned by the United States. It's a serious problem. And to talk about it, and of course, this is not unique to the US, it's also true of Canada and other parts of the world. But to talk about today is our guest, Brian Reisinger. Welcome to the program, Brian. It's great to have you on. This is a very
Hey,
important topic that I don't think is discussed enough.
yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I
Yeah,
think you're absolutely right. It's one of
yeah.
the many ways that farms disappearing in America and something that's happened in a lot of countries has a very serious
Mhm.
impact, not only on our food, but also national security and geopolitical issues.
hmm Now, you've written a really interesting book about this. We're going to talk about that and some of these implications for North America and quote unquote the free world. But before we go there, as we always do, we're going to talk about our framing aphorisms. Of course, these are in honor of your book and the topic we're discussing. The first is from Xi Jinping, the dictator who runs China, who says the pursuit of the Belt and Road Initiative is not meant to reinvent the wheel. Rather, it aims to complement the development strategies of countries involved by leveraging their comparative strengths. Next, from a lady named Irina Bakova, she says, I see the Belt and Road Initiative and its focus on cultural exchanges as cooperation in education and sciences as a renewal of the Silk Road. Next, from the outgoing president of the United States, Joe Biden, in one of his more coherent moments, said, if we don't figure a way in which these countries can grow and participate and be able to build infrastructure, the Chinese have a Belt and Road Initiative. He says, well, the Belt and Road Initiative turns out to be a debt and confiscation program. And finally, from the incoming president, the president elect Donald Trump, who says, we have lost thousands of factories since China opened up and joined the WTO. 70,000 factories we have lost. Can you believe it? It's hard to believe. I thought it was a typo. It is a greatest jobs theft in the history of the world. So, Brian, let's start with this. It sounds as though in your family, you have a deep history, a culture of farming, of working the land. And of course, this is something that's very, very basic to North American life. We're the breadbasket, really, for the Western world. So maybe just for our viewers and listeners, I'd like to hear from you, just get a sense of why farming is so much a part of your family's history, and why you think it's so vital that we retain the history and the functional family farm.
And what I found as I was writing Land Rich Cash Poor, I wanted to answer the question, why are our family farms disappearing? And I knew it was something that our family had seen and experienced. I didn't know the answer to it. And so we really weave hidden areas of history that drive that disappearance with my family's story. And that really gets down to why this matters so much. It is a personal story for me, but it is an issue happening in a rural area that really affects our entire country and beyond. It affects
hmm
our food supply, price, health, and otherwise. It affects national security, all kinds of other issues. And so I think it's one of those things that is meaningful to me, having grown up where I did with the roots that I'm fortunate to have had. And what I discovered as we worked on this book is the fact that what's happened to us and other families like us on the ground has massive implications for people who've never set foot in a barn.
hmm hmm the late Henry Kissinger once was quoted as saying that he who controls the food supply controls the world. And I want to talk about this, and this ties in somewhat to the content of your book, although I don't want to understate your book or limit it to political issues. It's much broader than that. I realize the focus is, but talking about this political issue, this food supply is really crucial to this battle for world hegemony, isn't it, between communist China and the United States? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it really is. And it's something that countries have recognized for a long time. And there's been a lot of political decisions made by great powers and large and small countries alike around how they're going to secure their food supply, how they're going to disrupt or supply the food supply of other countries. There's a lot of decisions that are made that affect all of us based on that. the situation that we're in now is one where a major foreign adversary, perhaps the most significant foreign adversary of communist China, is trying to get their hands on and to be able to hold captive on some level our food supply. It is not only the farmland they're buying up, but it is also where they're buying it up. They're buying it near military installations, which we shouldn't consider a coincidence. And now the overall amount of farmland owned by foreign countries is still relatively small in America. I want to be honest about that, but it is the rate of increase that has been so alarming to so many people. It increased by 15% in just 2 years recently. The foreign adversary piece and the degree to which China has been able to get their hands on farmland is a very serious problem. And it is a consequence in part of our disappearing family farms, because as our land ends up in fewer hands, it is easier for the Chinese to be able to come in and make meaningful purchases of farmland. It's very hard to do with the traditional North American concept of many small landowners. And that's slipping away. And so this threat is growing.
Mm-hmm. Xi Jinping and China talk about this thing called the Belt and Road Initiative. He says that, and I'm quoting him. He says China launched this BRI, we'll call it, to mobilize more resources, strengthen connectivity, leverage potential growth drivers, and connect markets. That all sounds good. He says it's designed to integrate more countries and regions into economic globalization and achieve shared prosperity through mutually beneficial cooperation. He says it embraces the historic trend of economic globalization, responds to the call for improving the global governance system, and addresses people's desire for a better life. That all sounds really rosy, but in boots on the ground, the Belt and Road Initiative doesn't really work that way, does it?
That's right. The American farmer, by the way, knows this instinctively, having worked to dig their living out of the ground and seen how China interacts with us. They can throw off world demand. They can affect our prices. So the Chinese have been capturing American agriculture and then dumping the prices down through the floor and really messing with the American farmer. When you combine that with all the ways that China has cheated on trade standards and all kinds of things with their currency and other things, farmers have known for a long time that we're getting screwed by China. And so the idea that we can just simply cooperate and not have to balance that with appropriate toughness is something that farmers know doesn't pass the smell test, so to speak.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
That's what they'd say where I'm from.
mm-hmm. And even if it were just China, that would be bad enough. But actually, one of the biggest enemies of farmers in countries like the United States and Canada is actually our own governments, isn't it?
Yeah. It's incredible to ponder because, any political leader will say that they support farmers and they may well mean it. And some of these things may be intentional and some may be unintentional. We may not ever really be able to know completely. But the reality is that in America, we've lost 45,000 farms per year on average for a century.
Wow.
And that means that the establishment of both parties at different points in our history have all changed places and gone back and forth and made all kinds of mistakes. A really good example is the 1980s farm crisis that some folks might remember, when tens of thousands of farms were wiped out. Both political parties for decades by then had been encouraging farms to get bigger or get out, grow and take on more scale or get out of the business. And at some point, if you continue to do that, you are squeezing out farms because there are some farms that aren't going to be able to make it. One of the ways that they did that was by encouraging farmers to take out government-backed debt. So this government-fueled debt was being taken out in order to expand. And then not long after that, they raised the interest rate to try to deal with the issue of inflation, as they've been doing in more recent years.
Mm-hmm.
And you can argue for or against both those decisions. You can argue for or against an effort to get farms to take out debt to be able to do more. You can argue for or against the adjustments around trying to address inflation. But when you do both of those things at one after the other without proper regard for the farmer, what you're doing is you're pushing debt on them, and then you're making that debt more expensive. And that is one of the things, not the only, but one of the things that triggered this massive farm crisis, where we lost tens of thousands of family farms for no reason other than the foolishness of our government.
Mm-hmm. And so, what you say needs to happen is our governments need to work cooperative with, or work in a way that's collaborative with farmers, so that the families like yours can continue to stay on the land and work the land and do what they've always done, and that is to create essentially food independence for countries like the United States and Canada. Like that's the goal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we see is that we are, and we share so much on this continent in terms of some of the challenges and forces that farmers on the ground in Canada and in America face. And each year it gets harder and harder to grind out a living.
Hmm.
And what we need to do is have a situation where our countries are securing our domestic food supply rather than wiping out thousands of farms a year, tens of thousands of farms a year in many of those years, and at the same time importing more food than we're exporting. We're basically wiping out our domestic food supply and saying we want to rely on foreign countries for our food to a much greater degree than I think is secure. And it goes back to
Hmm.
your central point of, do you have a food supply that you have control of? Because if you don't, someone else is controlling you.
This seems like a really obvious point, Brian. So, why? Who's not getting it? Why aren't governments, the domestic governments, that should be interested in food supply for Americans, for Canadians? Why are they not more focused upon making sure that conditions are ripe for farmers to flourish?
Well, I think in the case of political leaders, they've lost control of the situation. They were trying for the very long time to get as much food produced as possible, as cheaply as possible. And that's a good goal. But when it's the overriding thing and it's the only thing, what you end up doing is you end up wiping out farms of all kinds, of all sizes, and you end up crippling your food system. And we see that with our supply chain. COVID was the biggest example as industries were being shut down. We had a situation where you saw how fully integrated the food system is, where one big distribution center shuts down, and suddenly that means that the supply chain is locked up, and consumers can't get the food they need, or if they can, it's more expensive. And farmers can't sell their goods, and if they can, it's for a much lower price. So, how do you have consumers paying more and farmers getting less? This is a really kind of dystopian situation. And I think our political leaders have just simply lost control of it. I think the average person out there knows there's something not right. They sense there's something wrong, and they know that our farms are not only farms to feed us, but they're a part of ourselves. They have a sense there's something wrong. But the reality is that our societies are just more removed from what's going on the farm. We used to have more
Hmm.
families around the farm. And as that happens, it's natural for people to not necessarily know and understand what's going on the farm and how that connects to the food on the shelf for them.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I was looking at a map recently of North America, and it was showing that basically the most small L liberal places are all big cities, and the conservatives all live in the country. This is a serious disconnection, isn't it, culturally? And it's impacting things quite a bit in countries like the United States and Canada.
It really is. Our most recent election, whatever one's voting preference was, our most recent election showed that there is more Republican and conservative support in rural areas and more urban and suburban support for Democrats than there's ever been. It's more concentrated in that way. And one of the things that happens is when a country is separated that way, we're not just separated based on the ideas that we have, but we're separated on who we are as people. It's one of those divisions that's
Hmm.
really hard, and it creates a lot of these disconnects. And so you have people who obviously they care about their food, obviously, but they don't connect it to how these other issues affect farmers. And so it keeps us from solving problems like keeping our food more affordable. It keeps us from solving problems like how to make sure that we have plentiful, healthy food and secure food. There's a lot of problems we could solve if people who are of a bit different persuasions would understand what's driving them and work together with farmers or with whomever else that they may disagree.